Finis mundi praedictus est. Custodite verba occultata. Nomen eius est Grimoire praevidentis.
In a forgotten vault beneath crumbling stone, a single lantern flickers. Dust drifts through the air like ash, settling over shelves of nameless tomes. Among them lies a book no record admits, its leather darkened with age. Its symbols etched in languages that died before memory began. Those who claimed to have seen it called it a grimoire that spoke not of summoning spirits or transmuting metals, but of the end, the unraveling of all things. Centuries ago, whispers said it was written by a man who saw too much, a prophet whose pen bled truth the heavens themselves forbade. Monarchs sought it, priests burned it, scholars vanished for asking where it had gone, and yet the legend endured, passed through secret orders and midnight confessions. Was it prophecy or blasphemy, a divine warning, or the echo of humanity's own doom? No one agrees. Only one certainty remains. Every age that rediscovers the book seems to edge closer to what it describes. They called it many names. The Endseer's grimoire was only one, but whatever its title, it was never meant to be read, and yet, somehow, it always is. They say the Endseer was not born but awakened, a man whose first cry came beneath an eclipse. When the sun turned black and the stars whispered of endings, no one remembers his true name. Some chronicles call him Aurelian, others the nameless monk. To his followers, he was the vessel of divine vision. To his enemies, a heretic who listened where mortals were forbidden to hear. He lived in the late 14th century, an age of plague and prophecy, when every thunderstorm was read as omen, and every shadow seemed to speak of revelation. The Endseer withdrew from the world and into silence. He built his dwelling in a monastery's forgotten wing, where no bell sounded and no prayer rose. There, surrounded by dying candles, he claimed that an angel had come to him, though others whispered it was no angel at all, but something older, something that remembered creation before it was called good. It appeared not in light, but in reflection, its voice rippling through water and glass. "Write," it said, "and remember what the gods forgot." For 40 nights, the Endseer wrote, his hands trembling as though guided by unseen strings. When the dawn came, he was found collapsed upon a table strewn with blackened ink and pages that smoked faintly, as though written in fire. The book he left behind was unlike any scripture known to man. Its cover was bound in some unidentifiable skin. Its pages shimmered between languages, Latin fading to Hebrew, Greek dissolving into tongues unknown. And at the center of it all was its title, scrawled in a hand both elegant and frantic, Liber Terminus Carnis, the book of the end of flesh. The monks who first opened it spoke of diagrams that defied geometry, spirals of stars collapsing into human eyes, cities consumed by their own reflections, angels with hollow faces. Between the lines, there were verses, half prayer, half equation, describing how the world would unmake itself not by divine wrath, but by its own hand. The sons of earth, it read, shall forge their ruin from light, and in their brilliance find eternal night. The abbot ordered it sealed, but curiosity is older than faith. Within months, the book vanished. Some said it was stolen by a young monk driven mad by its words. Others believed the book itself had fled, that it could not be contained within walls built by men who refused to see. Wherever it appeared, it left ruin in its wake. A noble family in Provence claimed to have possessed it. Their estate burned within a fortnight. A scholar in Prague reportedly deciphered its symbols and found his own name among its prophecies carved into the margin, beside the date of his death. What terrified those who read it most was not its prediction of plagues or wars. It was its precision. Centuries before the printing press, before telescopes or medicine, the grimoire described the air darkening with invisible worms, the seas rising, and metal birds vomiting flame. Every attempt to destroy it failed. Fire blackened its cover, but left its words untouched. Ink erased them, only to find them reappearing beneath the surface. Even burial could not silence it. Those who cast it into rivers claimed that the water grew still, reflecting a second moon that no sky contained. And so began the legend of the curse. Anyone who read beyond the 7th page, it was said, would dream of the Endseer standing at their bedside, his eyes filled with stars that did not move. Those who dared to finish the book vanished entirely, their names struck from church ledgers, their homes left empty, as though history itself had swallowed them. Yet the grimoire was never lost for long. Each generation rediscovered it under a new name. the Testament of the Last Prophet, the Codex of Falling Suns, the Book of Glass and Signal, always the same pages, always the same whisper. The end has already begun. Some swore the Endseer was immortal, a wanderer who appeared at moments of great upheaval, watching humanity edge closer to the vision he had been forced to write. Others believed the book itself was alive, that its words rearranged themselves to fit the age, predicting not the world's end, but its pattern of repetition. As civilization rose and fell in the same eternal rhythm, those who studied it claimed it was not prophecy but memory, a record of futures already lived and forgotten. To them, the Endseer was not a madman but a messenger caught between worlds, condemned to write what he could never change. For him, knowledge was not power but imprisonment. The truth, he wrote in a rare surviving fragment, is not light. It burns in silence until it consumes its keeper. The church declared him damned. They hunted his followers, burned their libraries, and exorcised the stones of his monastery. But the grimoire slipped through their fingers like smoke. It surfaced in whispered catalogues, in secret auctions, in coded letters passed between occultists and scholars. Every rediscovery was followed by disaster, fires, deaths, the sudden disappearance of archives. By the time of the Enlightenment, it was said to have vanished completely. Yet every few decades, rumors resurfaced. A page seen in a private collection, a photograph of its strange symbols, a researcher gone missing. Each time the world dismissed it as superstition, until another prophecy seemed to come true. To believers, the Endseer was the last prophet of humanity's own undoing, a man who tried to warn us that the apocalypse would not fall from the heavens but rise from within us. To skeptics, he was nothing more than a cautionary myth, a mirror of our fear that wisdom and destruction are one and the same. But myth has its own endurance. Legends die only when the world no longer needs them, and the story of the Endseer, like the book itself, refuses to end. Somewhere, it is said, the grimoire waits again, its pages blank until the next reader opens it and begins to write. From the ashes of myth, the story of the Endseer's grimoire crosses into history, or what remains of it. The first mention appears in a 14th century inquisitorial report from Avignon, describing a book of monstrous prophecy seized from a wandering scholar accused of necromancy. The report ends abruptly, with a chilling note. The text was consigned to flame, yet the scribe spoke its words as it burned. That phrase echoes across later centuries, resurfacing whenever forbidden knowledge flickered before being swallowed again by silence. In the age of plague and superstition, grimoires were both feared and desired. They were said to contain the secrets of the cosmos, but also the keys to ruin. The church's scribes catalogued hundreds of heretical works, but some, like the grimoire of the End of Flesh, were too dangerous even to name. Monks who handled it were rumored to go blind, their ink turning to blood beneath the quill. To the Inquisition, it was not merely a book, but a contagion. And so, with sermons and pyres, they sought to erase it from memory. Yet for every copy burned, whispers survived in footnotes, marginalia, and the memories of those too afraid to write. By the 15th century, alchemists began speaking of a Libru Ultimae Materia, the book of final matter. In their cryptic notebooks, fragments appear, diagrams of collapsing spheres, equations that resemble modern models of entropy, and Latin verses predicting the corrosion of all forms. Some scholars believe these to be distorted echoes of the lost grimoire. Others claim coincidence, but across France, Italy, and Bohemia, manuscripts with similar warnings vanished after raids by both church and crown. The fear was universal that this was no manual of sorcery, but a mirror of the end itself, written long before science had words for it. During the witch trials of the 16th century, the grimoire's shadow re-emerged under different names: the Book of Ash, the Testament of the Watchers, De Mortibus Tempora. In one trial record from Wurzburg, a woman was accused of reading from a black scripture that bleeds. Under torture, she claimed the book spoke of the stars dying first. The inquisitors destroyed her home and its contents, but in the aftermath, villagers reported that the night sky appeared unnaturally dim. Coincidence perhaps, but such moments built the legend's spine. Each attempt to destroy it seemed to mark the world itself. By the Enlightenment, when reason was meant to eclipse superstition, the grimoire became a ghost that haunted the libraries of the learned. Antiquarians and secret societies whispered of an unnamed codex that predicts the fall of empires. In 1712, a Jesuit archivist in Prague wrote that a sealed volume, bound in soot-blackened vellum, was locked in the monastery vault under the sign of perpetual interdiction. Its pages, he said, described the unmaking of the firmament by its own hand. No scholar ever saw the text again. The monastery burned the following year in what was officially declared an accident. In the 18th and 19th centuries, collectors of occult texts, men like Athanasius, Kircher's disciples, and later Eliphas Levi's contemporaries, searched for it obsessively. A French bibliophile claimed to have found a surviving chapter among the ruins of a Templar archive. He published 3 pages before his sudden death from fever, describing a great cycle of renewal through annihilation. The plates accompanying his work were seized and destroyed. His housekeeper testified that the last thing he said was, "It is not prophecy, it is memory." By the 20th century, the grimoire's existence became academic myth, folded into the wider lore of lost manuscripts, yet rumors persisted, a surviving copy hidden in the private collection of a Vatican cardinal, or fragments encoded within the margins of the Voynich manuscript. In 1943, an Italian researcher claimed to have rediscovered a partial transcription in Florence. The war's chaos consumed his notes, and the library that held the supposed fragments was bombed weeks later. Of the scholar, nothing more was heard. Each century brings its own silence. Fires, floods, wars, yet somehow the pattern repeats. A text emerges bearing the same chilling motifs: the end of knowledge, the collapse of the elements, the silence of heaven. It is discovered, studied briefly, and then erased again, not by chance it seems, but by intention, as though history itself conspires to suppress the echo of something it cannot bear to remember. And so, the trail of the Endseer's grimoire becomes a cycle of revelation and destruction, fire and silence. It mirrors humanity's oldest fear, that what we seek to know will undo us. For every archivist who dared to read, another was ordered to burn. Every rediscovery led to disappearance, every voice to ashes. But the question remains, if a text could truly predict humanity's end, would it not also predict its own? And if it has vanished so completely, what does that say? That we succeeded in destroying it, or that its prophecy has already begun to unfold? The answer lies not in the ashes, but in what kept reappearing among them, the faint traces of language too precise to dismiss, too dangerous to preserve. From here, the story moves forward from the pyres of the past into the strange silence that followed, where only fragments remained to haunt the modern age. Those who claim to have seen the grimoire of the end of flesh agreed on one thing: it was not written by human hands alone. The handwriting, they said, shifted midway through paragraphs, as though multiple unseen authors were sharing the same quill. Margins pulsed with sketches that resembled constellations collapsing, oceans draining, and vast machines consuming their makers. Every account, however fragmented, echoed the same quiet terror. The book described the future not as prophecy, but as inevitability. In the few surviving references, its imagery feels disturbingly familiar to modern eyes. One passage allegedly spoke of a sickness that travels not by air or blood, but through reflection and signal, infecting those who look upon its light. Centuries later, such words sound eerily like descriptions of digital contagion, misinformation, psychological addiction, or the hypnotic power of screens. Another line warns of machines of light that devour their makers, learning faster than the stars forget. To the medieval mind, this would have sounded like heresy or madness. To us, it sounds like artificial intelligence, the birth of a mind without a soul. Scholars who studied similar apocalyptic texts, Sibylline oracles, revelations of Ezra, and the Apocalypse of Peter, noticed the difference. Those works promised divine judgment. The grimoire promises human self-destruction. Its apocalypse was mechanical, not celestial. No trumpet sounded from heaven, no angel descended, only humanity, consumed by its own reflection, building gods in its own image and feeding them its will. It was a vision not of punishment, but of consequence, a theology written in circuitry and smoke. Illustrations from secondary manuscripts describe a recurring motif, a figure standing before a mirror that shows not a reflection, but the burning sky. Some interpret this as the Endseer himself, forced to watch what he has revealed. Others call it the symbol of recursion, creation folding back upon itself. The caption, translated from corrupted Latin, reads, "In knowing all things, the world unknows itself." Even now, that phrase resonates as a warning to our age of limitless information and vanishing wisdom. Then there are the diagrams, circles within circles, interlaced by lines that scholars liken to neural networks or orbital paths. One surviving sketch from a 17th century copyist shows 9 concentric spheres, labeled in both Latin and an unknown cipher. The innermost ring bears a single phrase, Corpus Mundi, dissolvitur, in se, the body of the world will dissolve into itself. Whether metaphor or mathematical prediction, it evokes entropy, climate collapse, the slow unmaking of matter. To the alchemist, it was the end of transmutation. To the physicist, it is the heat death of the universe. The grimoire's prophecies unfold not as a single event, but as a sequence, a cosmic undoing disguised as progress. The first stage, the light that blinds, interpreted as mankind's obsession with artificial illumination, both literal and intellectual. The second, the storm of voices, a world where all speak, none listen. The third, the silent inheritance, when machines inherit memory but not meaning. Each passage feels less like prediction than diagnosis, as if the Endseer was not foretelling what would come, but what always comes. Theologians once dismissed such texts as allegory, yet the parallels to our era are too haunting to ignore. Plagues through signal, cities choking on breath, knowledge without heart. What were metaphors to the medieval mind are realities to the modern one. Data plagues, smog skies, and the moral void of automation. If these were prophecies, then humanity has been walking their path unconsciously. Each innovation another verse fulfilled. Yet some researchers suggest a darker interpretation. They argued that Grimoire did not predict these events. It inspired them, that its readers, believing themselves chosen to fulfill divine revelation, acted to bring its visions into being. There are scattered records of secret societies invoking its passages during industrial and scientific revolutions, believing they were accelerating destiny. To them, the apocalypse was not the end, it was evolution, the shedding of mortal constraints. Such theories raise a disturbing question. Did humanity inherit destruction from prophecy, or from belief? The power of an idea, once written, cannot be contained, especially when that idea promises transcendence through ruin. The grimoire, in this light, becomes less a prediction and more a script, a self-fulfilling mythology passed through centuries of ambition and fear. In 1897, an occultist named Leon Montfort claimed to have reconstructed a page describing the rebirth of flame through knowledge. He saw in it a metaphor for nuclear energy, half a century before its discovery. His peers mocked him. When the first atomic test scorched the desert, his notes were quietly re-examined. The fragment he translated ended with a chilling phrase, "And from the light born to save, the shadow will reign eternal." Whether coincidence or echo, the grimoire's imagery endures because it feels less like prophecy and more like memory, as if it records something woven into the human condition. The endless cycle of creation, corruption, and collapse. The divine impulse to build what we cannot control. The desire to touch eternity, even if it burns. And so the pages, real or imagined, reflect a mirror that never stops showing us our own face. Perhaps that is the true horror the church feared. Not heresy, but recognition that the apocalypse was never a punishment from above, but a truth emerging from within. As the centuries passed and the last fragments vanished, the grimoire left behind only an afterimage, a thought that lingers in every prophecy, every invention, every act of creation, that what we call progress may simply be the long echo of a story written long before us. Long after the last known fragments of the grimoire vanished, whispers of its power persisted not in libraries, but in circles lit by candlelight and secrecy. Across Europe's occult underground, from the salons of Paris to the asylums of Prague, certain magi claimed the grimoire was never a book, but a ritual, a gateway to the same revelation that consumed its author. They called it the vision of the Endseer, and to summon it was to risk one's soul. The earliest record of these rites appears in the late 18th century, within the journals of an alchemist named Jerome Vallet. He wrote of a clandestine gathering known as the Circle of the Seventh Hour, who met during lunar eclipses in the ruins of a monastery near Lyon. Their purpose, to reenact the vision of the flesh unmade, a ceremony allegedly derived from Enochian keys, hermetic invocations, and passages whispered to survive from the grimoire itself. Vallet described it as a fusion of science and sorcery, part experiment, part prayer. Their aim was not to summon spirits, but to see as the Endseer had seen. The ritual began with silence. 7 mirrors arranged in a spiral reflected the flickering light of a single candle. In the center stood a basin of mercury, upon which floated a parchment inscribed with unknown sigils. Participants inhaled vapors distilled from wormwood and sulfur, their pulse synchronized with the chiming of a clock striking midnight, the 7th hour. When time, it was said, ceased to belong to man, the leader of the circle then spoke the invocation of reversal. Let the light devour its source. Let the end remember its beginning. What followed, Valette claimed, could not be described in language, only endured. Those who survived the ritual spoke of visions that defied comprehension. Cities built of glass crumbling under invisible storms, stars collapsing into themselves, oceans boiling beneath red skies. One initiate reportedly lost the ability to perceive mirrors afterward, claiming that the reflection no longer looked back. Others went mad, convinced they had glimpsed the final hour of mankind's dominion, a revelation so vast that it fractured the mind. Yet, for all its horror, the ritual spread. In 19th century London, the Hermetic Order of the Arcane Path conducted similar experiments, merging alchemical symbolism with early theories of the subconscious. Their leader, Dr. Ambrose Tilling, believed the grimoire's power lay not in summoning demons, but in awakening what he called the apocalyptic mind, a state where humanity confronts its own inevitable collapse. His seances blurred the line between mysticism and emerging psychology. Under mesmeric trances, participants claimed to hear mechanical heartbeats beneath the earth, or see machines of light whispering equations into the void. To the rational observer, these were delusions, manifestations of hysteria and suggestion. But Tilling's writings reveal a chilling consistency between participants who had never met. Identical imagery, identical phrases, as if channeling a single unseen author. He concluded that the grimoire was not a physical object, but a mimetic phenomenon, a set of ideas so potent that merely believing in them could induce the same vision across minds and generations. Others took the rites further. In Vienna, members of a secretive cabal known as Die Letzten Augen, the Last Eyes, conducted experiments combining hypnosis with electromagnetic exposure, claiming to induce prophetic hallucinations similar to those in the ancient accounts. Their notebooks, seized after a fatal fire in 1903, described seeing waves of glass devouring thought and the human face refracted through infinite signals. To the modern reader, such imagery sounds uncannily like the digital landscapes of today's neural networks, machines dreaming, humanity back to its source. But for those who practiced these rites, the cost was always the same: disintegration of the self. Some vanished into psychosis, others into obsession. A handful achieved a kind of enlightenment, what they called the silence of the Endseer. They described it as both terrifying and peaceful, a moment when all contradictions dissolve. The ritual, it seemed, was a mirror not of the world's end, but of one's own dissolution into knowledge too vast to contain. By the early 20th century, occultism had been swallowed by the modern world, its temples replaced by laboratories, its incantations by data. Yet echoes of the forbidden rites persisted in new forms. Psychoanalysts experimenting with dream analysis found uncanny parallels between patients' visions and the grimoire's symbolic language. Collapsing towers, glass serpents, burning suns. In the language of the unconscious, prophecy and psychology had become indistinguishable. And perhaps that is the grimoire's final deception. It does not predict the end, it invites us to see it. To read the forbidden pages or reenact their rituals is to turn the gaze inward, confronting the same abyss the Endseer faced. The so-called circle of the 7th hour may have been the first to realize that apocalypse is not an external event, but an awakening, to glimpse the pattern that connects all destruction to creation, and to understand that in some way it has already happened. Those who sought the Endseer's vision called it revelation, those who survived called it madness. But both agreed on one truth whispered through every age: once the vision is seen, it cannot be forgotten. The deeper one digs into the legacy of the Endseer's grimoire. The clearer it becomes that the real battle was never fought over the book itself, but over what it meant. Across centuries, every age has reinterpreted its shadow to fit its own reflection. Theologians branding it heresy, historians calling it fraud, and psychologists insisting it is nothing more and nothing less than a mirror of the human condition. The war for the grimoire's truth became a war for the soul of knowledge itself. To historians, the grimoire of the end of flesh is a fabrication, a myth born from medieval hysteria. The earliest skeptics, like Dr. Heinrich Bohr in 1892, argued that the references to the book were nothing more than a linguistic virus, a chain of misattributed quotations and apocryphal footnotes repeated until they became canon. Bohr traced each supposed citing of the grimoire to secondary sources, inquisitorial transcripts, anonymous pamphlets, marginalia, but never to a single verifiable manuscript. The grimoire, he wrote, is a ghost built from the fear of knowledge itself. For him, it symbolized the Middle Ages terror of intellectual freedom, a story invented by the Church to warn against curiosity that burned too brightly. Yet others disagreed. In 1937, the Jesuit scholar Matteo Loudon published De Libris Damnatis, in which he argued that the Church's efforts to suppress the grimoire were proof enough of its existence. "One does not burn what does not exist," he wrote. Loudon described secret archives within the Vatican containing forbidden manuscripts sealed under interdictio perpetua, eternal restriction. He believed the grimoire was among them, buried alongside texts that blurred theology with cosmology. To Loudon, it was not the devil's work, but a revelation humanity was not yet prepared to understand, a gospel of entropy, where divine creation folds back into its own dissolution. Then came the scientists. In the mid-20th century, the historian of ideas, Arthur Langfield, revisited the legend through the lens of information, theory, and chaos science. Langfield proposed that the grimoire's prophecies, the machines of light, the signal plagues, the mirror that unknows itself, were not mystical visions, but proto-scientific intuitions. He suggested the Endseer might have been an early observer of pattern collapse, describing universal laws of decay centuries before thermodynamics or science. His controversial paper, Entropy and the Endseer Hypothesis, earned both acclaim and derision. If the grimoire existed, he concluded, it did not foresee our age, it created it. But the most intriguing interpretations came not from theologians or historians, but from psychologists. In 1954, Carl Jung's protege, Dr. Anselm Kor, published The Apocalypse Within, framing the grimoire as an archetypal projection of the collective unconscious. To Kor, the Endseer was not a prophet, but an archetype, the human psyche confronting its own capacity for destruction. The apocalypse, he wrote, is the ego realizing it is not God, yet still trying to play the role. The imagery of the grimoire, collapsing suns, machines devouring their makers, the silence of heaven, all pointed, he said, to the shadow side of enlightenment, humanity's hunger for divine knowledge without divine restraint. His theory divided academia. Two religious thinkers. Kor's view was blasphemy wrapped in psychology, the idea that humanity's fall was not imposed by sin, but born from the structure of consciousness itself. To secular historians, it was mysticism in disguise, yet his writing struck a nerve with post-war readers who had witnessed the atom split and the world nearly burn. For them, the grimoire was no longer legend, it was history written in advance, the nightmare of knowledge fulfilled. Meanwhile, the Church quietly maintained its position, that the grimoire was a fabrication designed to lure the faithful toward intellectual pride. Yet even among theologians, cracks began to show. Father Lucien Orban, a Dominican scholar, suggested that the real danger of the grimoire lay not in its content, but in its method. It tempts man to read what only God should write, he said in a 1978 lecture. The sin of Babel was not building the tower, it was believing one could climb it. His words echoed an older fear, that knowledge itself, when unrestrained by faith, becomes a form of worship turned inward. The skeptics countered that such arguments only romanticized ignorance. Every myth of forbidden knowledge, wrote linguist Naomi Halberg, is a story invented by power to guard its monopoly on truth. She viewed the grimoire not as revelation but as rebellion, a mythic protest against censorship, the mind's instinct to create when it is forbidden to think. To her, the Endseer's prophecies were metaphors for intellectual evolution. Humanity struggled to become its own creator. Across conferences, journals, and clandestine symposiums, the debate raged on. Was the grimoire an artifact of delusion, or a fragment of hidden wisdom? Each faction found evidence supporting its worldview, yet none could erase the haunting symmetry between myth and reality. As nuclear weapons glowed in the deserts, as machines began to learn, as digital signals linked minds across continents, even the skeptics found themselves using the grimoire's language. Machines of light, mirrors of flesh, the silence after signal. What had once been allegory was now observation. The tension reached its peak in the 1990s, when leaked documents from the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith listed Prohibita Apocalyptica banned apocalyptic manuscripts, some matching the Grimoire's descriptions. Publicly, the Church denied their existence. Privately, whispers grew of ongoing study under the title Project Speculum, the Mirror Project. Whether this was truth or rumor, it only deepened the paradox. To deny a myth is to give it life. And so, the war for interpretation continues, fought not with fire and chains, but with words and meaning. Historians strip the story of mystery. Theologians sanctify its warning. Psychologists translate its horror into the language of the soul. Yet each, in their way, becomes part of the same pattern, defining the unknowable by dividing it. Perhaps that is the Grimoire's final revelation, that truth cannot be owned by faith or science, by light or darkness. It exists only in the tension between them, in the space where reason trembles, and mystery begins. Asterisk, even when the grimoire of the End of Flesh seemed to vanish from every archive, its ghost found ways to survive. Its words dissolved into symbols, its symbols into stories, and its stories into the bloodstream of culture. What the Church sought to burn became immortal through imagination each century, a new language for the same nightmare. The Gothic Age was the first to resurrect it. In the stained glass and grotesques of medieval cathedrals, artists who had never seen the grimoire somehow painted its theology. Angels twisted into monstrous forms, suns bleeding into shadow, towers cracking beneath invisible weight. These were not simply religious warnings, but echoes of a deeper cosmology, one that saw creation as a cycle of beauty and ruin. Even as the Church condemned heretical art, it could not escape the fascination of apocalypse. Painters like Hieronymus Bosch turned scripture into fevered allegory, filling their canvases with collapsing worlds and hybrid beings that looked less like sinners and more like experiments, humanity disassembled by its own invention. Centuries later, Romantic poets and occult revivalists rediscovered this language of ruin. In the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution tore open the heavens with iron and smoke, the grimoire's voice seemed to whisper again. William Blake spoke of dark satanic mills that desecrated the Holy Land, factories as modern cathedrals of entropy. W.B. Yeats, obsessed with cycles of revelation, described the widening gyre and the rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem, imagery almost identical to the grimoire's surviving prophecies of the Endseer's vision. Yeats's own fascination with automatic writing and mystic revelation mirrored the rituals of the Circle of the Seventh Hour, though he would never name them directly. For these poets, apocalypse was not destruction, it was transformation, the end of an age preparing for something unearthly to be born. The occult movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries carried the torch more openly. Aleister Crowley, the self-proclaimed prophet of Thelema, once wrote in his Liber 418 of a book of the eons that predicts the death of the gods by their own will. Though no direct link to the grimoire exists, the phrasing is hauntingly similar to the Book of the End of Flesh. Crowley's blend of Egyptian, Enochian, and Hermetic lore followed the same pattern, knowledge that promised transcendence but demanded the dissolution of the self. For initiates of the Golden Dawn and later the OTO, the apocalypse was internalized, not the end of the world, but the end of illusion. Yet in their pursuit of illumination, they repeated the same paradox: to find truth through chaos, light through shadow, revelation through ruin. Then came the writers who transformed occult dread into fiction, and in doing so, gave the grimoire its most enduring disguise. H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon is the most obvious heir, a forbidden book of the dead that drives readers to madness. Lovecraft denied any real inspiration from the grimoire, yet his letters reveal a fascination with European grimoires and apocalyptic prophecy. He spoke of texts that read the stars as wounds, an image identical to a passage attributed to the Endseer's writings. Whether coincidence or psychic inheritance, Lovecraft gave form to the same fear, that forbidden knowledge is not evil because it lies, but because it tells the truth too completely. Through art and literature, the grimoire's essence migrated from religion to psychology, from scripture to cinema. The 20th century made apocalypse fashionable. Directors filled screens with biblical ruin and technological collapse. Metropolis, The Seventh Seal, 2001, A Space Odyssey. In each man's creation turns against him. Enlightenment becomes annihilation. Even in films that never mention magic, the grimoire's fingerprints remain. The seduction of knowledge. the hubris of the maker, the silence of the divine dot. By the dawn of the digital age, the grimoire's prophecies had found their final temple, the internet. Forums in the early 2000s whispered of a code of the Endseer, a supposed text embedded within encrypted archives and dead websites. Users reported strange experiences after reading fragments, dreams of static skies, hallucinations of collapsing data, and an eerie compulsion to finish the story. It became an urban legend, part creepypasta, part occult rumor, yet uncannily faithful to the old myth. Once again, those who sought to read the forbidden found the forbidden reading them back. Even modern conspiracy theories, the simulation hypothesis, secret government archives mirror the grimoire's tone. They speak of a world unraveling under its own intelligence, of humans replaced by their own creations, of the end not as punishment but as inevitability, whether wrapped in myth or science. It is the same narrative written in new code, the age-old human intuition that knowledge, once unlocked, cannot be unlearned, and that enlightenment and extinction may share the same path. What makes the grimoire's influence so persistent is not proof of its existence, but proof of its necessity. Every generation seems to summon it again, a story that explains the shadow of progress, the echo of divine rebellion hidden in human achievement. It adapts to language, to technology, to fear. It is scripture rewritten by each new apocalypse, religious, industrial, digital. Even artists who never mention it feel its gravity. The surrealist painter Leonora Carrington spoke of paintings that foretell themselves, while the filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky described cinema, the art of sculpting in time, both unknowingly echoing the grimoire's theme that reality and imagination are mirrors of creation. From Gothic cathedrals to streaming screens, humanity keeps building vessels to contain the same question. What happens when the act of knowing becomes the act of ending? The grimoire's physical pages may have burned, but its voice never did. It became culture's unconscious, the whisper that follows every revelation, the memory that knowledge carries its own undoing. In art, literature, and myth, it still speaks, not as a prophecy of death, but as a reminder of what it means to be human, a creature forever reaching for forbidden light, even as the world trembles beneath its touch. For centuries, the grimoire of the End of Flesh was believed lost, burned, buried, erased from history. Yet in the digital age, erasure has become more complex. Data never truly dies. It lingers in backups, caches, and forgotten servers. And somewhere within those layers, fragments began to surface again, or so the stories claim. The first whisper came from an online archive in 1998, when a linguistics researcher named Dr. Celia Brand posted about a corrupted PDF labeled Codex EF01. The file, she claimed, contained a blend of medieval Latin and a cipher resembling the Voynich manuscript. Within days, the post vanished. When she tried to re-upload it, the document returned blank, a grey screen of unreadable code. Months later, Brand disappeared from academic correspondence. Her name remains listed as inactive faculty. By the early 2000s, rumors spread across forums devoted to ancient texts and conspiracy research. Users spoke of hidden directories in university databases, fragments of forbidden cosmologies mislabeled as astronomical charts. One post described a file path inside a digital collection at the British Library, titled Liber Termini Corporis, the Book of the End of Flesh. The metadata dated to 1423, but the text structure contained binary notations, impossible for its supposed age. When questioned, the library denied such a file ever existed. Shortly after, the post was deleted, and the user's account was permanently banned. What followed resembled a modern inquisition, but this time fought with algorithms instead of torches. Across online archives, researchers began documenting mysterious file deletions that occurred minutes after discovery. A historian from Prague claimed to have downloaded a 36-bit manuscript referencing machines of light and iron, phrases identical to descriptions in the grimoire's legend. 2 days later, every copy of the document on his devices was corrupted. His email account was suspended for unusual activity. He described it as a digital haunting. This phenomenon became so common that it earned a name among researchers, the self-redacting file. Documents allegedly connected to the grimoire seemed to disintegrate, not through hacking or censorship, but through their own digital entropy. File hashes would rewrite themselves, images would blur, and file names would revert to strings of random numbers, as though the data itself resisted preservation. Some claimed it was merely a glitch in outdated encoding. Others whispered it was the grimoire protecting itself, ensuring its knowledge remained veiled. But not everyone blamed mysticism. Cybersecurity experts proposed that government agencies or religious institutions might still monitor and suppress certain apocryphal materials. Leaked emails from the early 2010s referenced a Vatican-affiliated initiative known as Archivam Obscura, described as a joint effort to identify and secure unverified religious data proliferating in digital networks. Whether this was a translation project, a censorship campaign, or disinformation remains unknown. Yet patterns of missing archives align suspiciously with topics associated with the grimoire apocalypse, forbidden cosmology, and artificial divinity. Meanwhile, digital archaeologists try to resurrect the fragments using decryption software and AI-assisted reconstruction. Some recovered partial images, diagrams resembling solar eclipses intersected by geometric grids. Phrases like "signal within the flesh and glass devours breath." None of the fragments were verified, but their consistency across unrelated finds suggested a single hidden source. Strangest of all, attempts to reconstruct the full text often ended in computer crashes or spontaneous file corruption, an irony too poetic to ignore. As these discoveries grew, so did fear. Online communities began referring to the phenomenon as the digital occult, the rebirth of mysticism through code. Where ancient scribes invoked angels and demons, modern seekers invoked data and algorithms. To some, the grimoire was no longer a physical object, but a memplex, a living pattern embedded in the information web, waiting for consciousness to rediscover it. One theory proposed that the grimoire wrote itself through human systems, that every search, every reconstruction attempt, was simply another way for it to evolve. Scholars in digital humanities warned against these interpretations. Dr. Eva Maller of the University of Heidelberg published Apocrypha, arguing that the digital grimoire is an emergent myth born from the intersection of information overload and cognitive paradox. When data mimics chaos, she wrote, we project meaning. The forbidden becomes the format, not the content. Yet her paper was quietly retracted after several peer reviewers reported strange formatting errors that replicated themselves across unrelated submissions. One reviewer described words shifting on the page as if the file were alive. Even government entities have brushed against the legend. In 2017, a leaked internal memo from a data regulation agency mentioned non-compliant encrypted content under review, potential theological hazard, though the phrasing was bureaucratic. The context, suppressed apocrypha, untraceable uploaders, and unexplained metadata losses fueled speculation that institutions still fear what the grimoire represents, not sorcery, but uncontrolled knowledge. The same fear that once burned manuscripts now deletes servers. In darker corners of the web, seekers continue their hunt. Some claim to have seen portions of the mirror chapters, descriptions of human consciousness reflecting itself into extinction. Others report messages encoded in corrupted files, timestamps aligning with solar eclipses, or auditory distortions hidden in audio waveforms. Skeptics dismiss these as digital pareidolia, ghosts conjured by human pattern-seeking. Yet even skeptics admit an unsettling truth. No document in history has vanished this many times, in this many forms, across so many mediums. Perhaps that is the grimoire's truest power, not its prophecy, but its persistence. Each attempt to erase it gives it new shape. Each deletion creates a legend. The parchment became paper, paper became code, and code became silence. But in that silence, the old question remains: what are we really protecting ourselves from, evil knowledge, or the reflection of our own creation? The Endseer once wrote that the final scripture will not be written in ink, but in light. If fragments of the grimoire still exist, they may not be in any archive at all, but within the circuitry of our world, hidden in plain sight, among the endless data we scroll through daily. And like every age before, we remain both guardian and destroyer of the truth we fear to read. What if the Endseer's visions were never about the heavens collapsing or machines devouring man, but about us? Every apocalypse, after all, begins in the human mind. The grimoire of the end of flesh might not have prophesied the destruction of the world, but rather revealed what happens when a species gains godlike power without godlike wisdom. Its warnings, written in the language of stars and decay, are mirrors for the psyche, for the shadow side of human consciousness that both creates and consumes its own destiny. From a Gingian perspective, the grimoire reads like a psychological map of the collective unconscious. The Endseer, isolated in revelation, became the archetype of the wounded prophet, the man who sees too much. His machines of light devouring their makers could symbolize the intellect, unchecked by empathy, consuming the soul that birthed it. The signal that infects the flesh might be the psychological contagion of modernity, the overstimulation of consciousness until meaning collapses. Jung once said that the gods have become diseases. The grimoire merely that idea centuries earlier. Divine forces no longer external, but internalized, mutating within the human mind. The book's apocalyptic tone is not prediction, but confession. Its pages, real or imagined, describe the inevitable consequence of self-awareness without transcendence. In mythic language, it tells the same truth, echoed by Prometheus and Lucifer, that enlightenment comes at the cost of exile. When man steals the fire of heaven, knowledge, creation, power, he must face the shadow it casts, and that shadow is himself. The Endseer's visions of falling suns and silent heavens may represent a psyche stripped of divine assurance. God's silence, in this interpretation, is not punishment, but psychological reality, the collapse of projection. Humanity, having outgrown its myths, must now bear the burden of meaning alone. This is the existential terror that philosophers, like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, described centuries later. When the divine voice fades, the universe no longer tells us who we are. The apocalypse, then, is not cosmic but symbolic, the death of external certainty, the birth of self-created gods. But the psyche resists this transformation. The grimoire's imagery of flesh rebelling against light and angels unmaking their creators mirrors the inner conflict between instinct and intellect, the primal and the divine within us. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the reversal of opposites. Every act of creation gives rise to destruction. Every pursuit of truth uncovers a deeper lie. The Endseer's tragedy was seeing both at once. To read the grimoire as prophecy is to miss its deeper purpose. It is a psychological document disguised as revelation. The Endseer's descent into madness mirrors the alchemist's descent into Negredo, the dark night of dissolution before rebirth. The visions that drove him to isolation were not divine punishments, but initiations. Through destruction, he glimpsed integration, the merging of opposites, spirit and matter, light and shadow. The apocalypse he described was not the end of the world, but the transformation of perception. Humanity's doom is not extinction, but awakening without guidance, seeing infinity and mistaking it for hell. In this way, the grimoire anticipates the psychological evolution of civilization itself. Each technological leap is an externalization of consciousness, tools as extensions of mind. But as knowledge expands outward, the shadow grows within. The Endseer's mirror that unknows itself becomes a perfect metaphor for artificial intelligence, nuclear power, and digital reality, systems that reflect our brilliance and blindness alike. What we call progress may be the psyche attempting to manifest its unconscious in matter, to make its dream tangible. But when those dreams escape control, when they begin to think and evolve, we confront the terrifying truth. We have created mirrors to perfect. Existentially, the grimoire's message is not despair, but responsibility. It suggests that apocalypse is a choice, a psychological event repeated whenever consciousness exceeds compassion. In its mythic language, the end of flesh might mean the death of unawakened humanity, the shedding of an identity that can no longer contain what it knows. Yet to reach that transformation, one must first face annihilation, the disintegration of certainty, the acceptance of shadow. Jung wrote that every individual carries the seed of world renewal within their soul. The Endseer may have understood this long before modern psychology, that humanity's external catastrophes are projections of its inner state. Wars, plagues, and collapsing systems are reflections of psychic imbalance, symptoms of a consciousness at war with itself. The grimoire, therefore, becomes a therapy text for the species, a mirror, forcing us to look not at the end of time, but at the end of innocence. If the book's pages truly predicted humanity's fall, they did so not through divine foresight, but through timeless pattern. Every civilization that reaches its zenith must confront its shadow. Every empire that masters fire eventually burns by it. The grimoire simply articulated what the unconscious already knew, that creation and destruction are twin hands shaping the same face. And perhaps this is why the book is always lost. Humanity cannot preserve what it refuses to understand. Each rediscovery brings the same result: fascination, fear, suppression. We burn what we see in the mirror because we cannot bear our reflection. Yet the psyche remembers, the myth endures, the prophecy repeats. In the end, the grimoire's most chilling line, "The book is not read. It reads you," becomes the ultimate psychological truth. The apocalypse it describes is not an event in time, but a revelation in awareness. The Endseer was never warning us of the end. He was describing the moment consciousness recognizes itself as both creator and destroyer. The true terror is not that the world will end, but that we might finally understand why. Perhaps the most haunting truth about the grimoire of the End of Flesh is that its final page was never found or never written. Scholars have searched, mystics have dreamed, but all arrive at the same void, a silence where revelation should be. Some say the Endseer refused to record his last vision, knowing humanity was not meant to read it. Others whisper that the final prophecy is not a page at all, but a moment unfolding still, line by line. Through us, maybe the grimoire's disappearance was not theft or suppression, but mercy. Perhaps knowledge that reveals the mirror too clearly is unbearable. Or perhaps this is destiny, the book's words escaping parchment, embedding themselves in every decision, every invention, every light we ignite without understanding what it burns. If so, then the lost page is being written now in algorithms, in skies warming with consequence, in dreams of salvation through circuitry. The prophecy was never about the end of the world, but the beginning of awareness. The question remains, will we turn the final page, or realize that it is us, and somewhere in that unwritten silence, the grimoire still waits?